Hi, everybody. Thanks. I am the guy standing between you and lunch, so I take that responsibility very seriously. So I'm here to talk about a new set of guidelines that are going to be coming out pretty shortly on the certification of annual equipment inspections. And I've worked at Engineers and Geoscientists BC, as we heard, for just over a year. Actually, yesterday was my one-year anniversary, so I feel like I've crossed the finish line of sorts. I am a municipal engineering consultant by experience. I used to do pipe and road design, so this is not my world. But I think as I'm going to describe, you'll understand what Engineers and Geoscientists BC's role is when it comes to guidelines like this, and the responsibilities that we're ceding to people like yourselves, the technical experts. So this guideline is not out yet. It's going to be coming out just before the end of the year, so you guys get a little bit of a sneak peek, which is exciting. And my pitch for the presentation is that hopefully by the end of the presentation, you'll understand why we decided to do this guideline, what the purpose of the guidelines are, and why this guideline is important for professionals and non-professionals working in this industry. And the importance is in making the standard of practice in this area clear to everybody working in this industry. So an outline of my presentation, I'm going to start at the highest level, talk about the role of Engineers and Geoscientists BC, talk about our professional practice department where I'm a staff member, talk about our professional practice guidelines, what they're intended to do, and some examples, and then talk about our guidelines for the annual inspections. So just to get a sense of the room, by a show of hands, who is a registered professional engineer in the room, or EIT engineering licensee? Excellent. That's great because that means that most of what I'm going to talk about with the role of Engineers and Geoscientists BC is not redundant. So Engineers and Geoscientists BC, for those of you who aren't as aware as those people with their hands up, we're the regulatory body for engineers and geoscientists in the province. We were founded in 1920, and that was just the engineering side. The geoscience side came quite a bit later in the 90s. So 2020 upcoming is our 100th year, and we have about 37,000 registrants in the province. So that's engineers, geoscientists, EITs, GITs, and licensees. And our enabling goals are the following up there. I won't read them out for you, but just drawing your attention to goal number 2 there, establishing, maintaining, and enforcing qualifications and professional standards. That's where these guidelines and guidelines like them fall into. So our role as a regulator, on the regulatory side, we also have kind of an advocacy side for engineers and geoscientists in the province. But on the regulatory side, you can think about what we do through either the proactive or the reactive mechanisms. So at the start of your career as a professional engineer or geoscientist, you deal with our registration department where we set up registration requirements. During your life as a practicing professional, you would deal mostly with my department, which is setting standards of practice for various types of engineering and geoscience and working on proactive regulation. And then unfortunately, if you fall afoul of those standards of practice, you may come into contact with our legal department that does the investigation and discipline of complaints. So on the regulatory side, as I mentioned, I'm part of the professional practice department. And I just wanted to run through some of the programs that are complementary to the guideline work that I'm going to be talking about. So we have a practice advice program where we have 4 full-time practice advisors. People call in with their practice questions as granular or as high level as people want. And we receive over 1,000 calls and emails every year from practicing professionals to help them deal with questions that they have. We have a practice review program where we review about between 100 and 200 professionals every year and go through their practice more in depth. And that's really, as I said, the proactive side, helping professionals understand where they may be not following regulations properly and helping them get back on track. Not supposed to be a punitive program at all. We're working on various things around climate change and sustainability right now. We're working on a climate change action plan for the association. And I'll talk about these 3 more in depth: our OQM program, our support for various committees, and our professional practice guidelines. So right now we have what's called the Organizational Quality Management Program, which is a voluntary program for engineering and geoscience companies, or companies that employ practicing engineers and geoscientists. As you can see, we have almost 400 organizations, and this is all types from government ministries down to sole practitioners. And we have a bunch of quality management guidelines in our act. that are required for professionals to follow. And this program is based on making sure that companies are following those those quality management requirements. And so we go into an organization, we help them with their quality management, so things like document retention, how people use their engineering seals properly, and try to help them facilitate keeping their professionals on side of the regulations. And this is going to be transitioning in a couple of years. I guess I'm speaking mostly to the people whose hands were up, but in a couple of years to what will be called the Regulation of Firms, which is a mandatory program. And this is based on some regulatory changes by the province that came in last year called the Professional Governance Act. And one of the top goals of that act, this is not my opinion, it was a political process that was brought about by the last election. And one of the top goals was to hold engineering firms responsible for problems in the industry, whereas we currently can only hold individuals responsible for their own professional issues. So it's going to be based on the same voluntary program we have currently, but I think what's interesting is to know that I got to see the wording here, all entities in the private and public sector that provide products or services in BC requiring the practice of professional engineering or professional geoscience will be regulated. So again, that's quite a broad mandate. We're talking about municipalities and government ministries, again, all the way down to sole practitioners. So there's an Office of the Superintendent of Professional Governance in the province that we work with closely to bring in this enabling regulation, and we're aiming for June of 2021 to start registering firms. We support about 15 professional practice related committees, and the reason I mention this is because these committees are where we get a lot of our push to do various professional practice guidelines, like the one I'm going to talk about today. And this is our check-in with people that are working in the industry to bring us problems that they see and help us develop regulatory solutions. And professional practice guidelines. So what is a professional practice guideline and what is the purpose of it? This is a bit of a hard concept for me to get my head around coming from industry into the regulatory world pretty recently. And the concept here is that we are making explicit the standard of practice in a specific area. So these guidelines are meant to take an area of practice, for example, annual equipment inspections, or on-site sewerage systems that people have been doing for years or centuries in some cases, and make the level that people should be practicing at, what we think of as a minimum bar approach, explicit, so that everybody that's working in that area knows what they need to be doing and what they need to be considering to stay on side of the regulations. So these are not technical and they're not prescriptive guidelines. This isn't a code, it's not a how-to guide to do engineering. It's the considerations that professionals need to keep in mind as they work in their practice. So for example, a guideline might make professionals aware of various codes and standards they may need to follow, but it's not going to walk you through how to actually use those codes and standards. And these are called guidelines for a reason. They're not laws or bylaws. So it sets a standard of practice, but a professional can deviate from these guidelines if they have a good reason for doing so. And that does come up occasionally in our practice review process. People have good reasons for not following these if there is a bit of a less prescriptive approach you can take and still meet the considerations. So some of our recent examples, just to give you a flavor of the broad spectrum of guidelines that we work on. We do guidelines on seismic retrofit of buildings, seismic design of bridges, so we have a lot in the structural area. We have a recent one on whole building energy modeling, so that's more mechanical and electrical in nature. And then sometimes we do guidelines that are more broad, that apply to a lot of different areas of engineering and geoscience, like our sustainability guidelines. So again, how do we determine that standard of practice? It's about working with our partners out in the industry and other regulatory bodies and comparing the standard that an engineer needs to, or geoscientist needs to be kept to, with what would be expected of a reasonable and competent person in the same circumstances. And these guidelines come about usually in 3 different ways, and I'll touch on how this one in particular came about in a second. But usually there's either a response to some sort of incident out there in the industry. There's maybe a public failure of some kind. Sometimes it's based on a perceived risk by practitioners. And sometimes the government has a specific area of safety that they want to enact legislation to protect public safety. And so we get ideas from our committees, from other regulators, from the industry, from the government. And sometimes we do these based on a contract with one of our ministries. We've done contracts with the Ministry of Transportation, Energy Management, BC. We've also done them based on contracts with people like BC Hydro. So once we have the idea, the genesis of the guideline, we go out and find those funding partners, set up contracts. We then go out and determine who should be the lead authors for these. And just wanted to emphasize that point that Engineers and Geoscientists BC staff, our role is to project manage these guidelines and help the process along and help deal with the formatting. But the guidelines themselves, especially the guideline I'm going to talk about today, are written by professionals working in that area of practice. And they're usually suggested through our industry contacts as people who are particularly knowledgeable about this area. Once we have the authors selected, we have them work on a first draft or first couple of drafts. We go out into the wider industry and recruit a larger review group, usually about 15 to 20 people. And the authors in the review group go back and forth on edits. This process usually takes between maybe a year, year and a half to up to 2.5 years at the long end. And finally, once they've gone back and forth a few times, we get ready to release this guideline into the world. And once we release it out, we expect to get feedback from the industry. So I'm expecting all of you, once these guidelines are out, to send us your feedback. And these are meant to be living documents. They get reviewed every 5 years or so. And we expect to incorporate edits as the industry changes over time. And we also commit to doing communications and outreach events when these guidelines come out, just to make sure that everyone is aware of them and knows how to apply the guidelines. We have a standard format, and I think that it can be illustrated with these questions. So we go through and talk about the roles and responsibilities of people in this area. So who is involved in this area of practice and how are they related to each other? We have our guidelines for professional practice, so what's expected of professionals in this area? Quality management, what are the special considerations around our quality management requirements? Talk about registration, education, training, and experience, so who's qualified to do this work? And then a lot of times we have case studies or assurance documents that we append to the back. Okay, so that's all the high-level stuff. Now let's talk about these guidelines that are going to be coming out before the end of the year. So the guidelines are on the certification of annual equipment inspections. And the guideline work was initiated through our partners at WorkSafe BC and through our various professional practice committees. So it was evident based on our conversations with them that there was a lack of consistency in the industry and understanding about the certification process. And you guys are probably all aware of the very notable concrete pumper failure in 2016. So the guideline didn't specifically come out of that failure, but the work was informed by WorkSafe BC's investigation of that event. And so we partnered with WorkSafe BC, and you guys are probably all asking, why does Engineers and Geoscientists BC, as this high-level regulatory body, care about something so granular as the inspections of mobile equipment? And so as I mentioned, we're working on developing a standard of practice, and for professionals, the guideline is about clarifying your responsibilities, keeping you out of trouble, and making sure that it levels the playing field among professionals so that everybody knows what the minimum level of work they need to be doing is. For non-professionals, why do you care? You're going to understand why professionals and when professionals are needed in this industry and what they're expected to do. So clarifying the scope and deliverables for professional certification, knowing that you're getting what you're paying for when you hire a professional, and that what you get from one professional is going to meet the level of practice of another professional. And for the regulatory partners, it's fleshing out their regulations with more descriptions and more key considerations for professionals. And who are the authors? So our authors on this are Ryan Stewart from Arsenal Engineering, who's here in the back, and Matthew Smith from SKC Engineering. So I'm going to take you through the guidelines, just touching on each of the sections. And the scope of the guidelines apply to the various types of mobile equipment that are covered in the WorkSafe BC regulations. But there is a key or a consideration in the guidelines that the document should also be applied to other types of equipment where an inspection certification has been requested, such as tower cranes, which need a structural inspection completed before each erection. So for tower cranes, although some of the guidance around mechanical and controls inspections wouldn't apply, there's other guidance, examples, and forms that you can use in your inspection process. So in the roles and responsibilities section, you can add the graphic actually might be large enough that you can see it on this size of screen. But we go through the different parties that are involved in this and how they're related to each other, how the flow of information should work. And it talks about the responsibilities of the different parties, such as clients, OEM, engineer of record, different types of inspectors, specialists, welders and fabricators, and technicians. And it specifically touches on the different types of specialists that may be used if the engineer of record doesn't have sufficient expertise in a particular area. In our guidelines for professional practice section, this is kind of the meat of the document, outlining the considerations that professionals need to be aware of. And it talks about what should be considered when creating the inspection plan, and actually we heard in the last presentation why that's particularly important. We have examples in Appendix D that I'll talk about of an inspection plan process. It talks about what to consider during the mechanical, control, and structural inspections, how to document those inspections properly, how to ensure that the personnel that are working on those are qualified, and how to initiate repairs. And then we also talk about what should be included in the inspection reports and how to provide that final Safe for Work certification. So we have sample certification forms that I'll show you an example of, but it's also possible to prepare your own certification documents based on specific information we include in this section. We talk about quality management. So quality management is kind of a pie in the sky concept to a certain extent, but we go through the different quality management bylaws that professionals need to be following in their practice. And in this particular area, the one that we highlight is the idea of direct supervision versus direction of personnel. So we have a quality management bylaw on direct supervision, which covers when a professional engineer or geoscientist delegates work to perhaps a junior staff member or a field worker, but the professional is still taking responsibility for that person's work. So the professional is on the hook for whatever comes out of that. In the inspection process, there's relationships between professional engineers and non-professional engineers, which don't meet that level. The professional engineer is not taking responsibility for their work, but has to rely on their expertise. And so in this section, we talk about what personnel need to think about and look for when they're working with those personnel to make sure that everybody can trust the level of information that's coming out of that interaction. We have a section on registration, education, experience, and training, so providing typical qualifications for who an engineer of record might be that's certifying these annual equipment inspections, and talks about the use of specialists. And then in our appendices, we have some helpful documents, we think. We have a list of the equipment that's covered under the regulations, the equipment type, relevant standards, the certifications required, and what the inspection qualifications are for structural inspections and recommended repair welding standards. We have Appendix B, which includes a number of case studies around mobile cranes, movable work platforms, boom crawlers, and aerial devices. And the intention here is to illustrate various scenarios that might come about in the annual inspection process and talk about whether or not the standard of practice was met for professionals that were involved in that scenario, and really trying to illustrate the pitfalls that people can get into and how to avoid them. Appendix C, we have our sample certification assurance forms. So we've provided 3 forms that have been standardized and vetted. One that's a general safe for use form, one that's a limited form for mechanical and controls inspections, and one that's a limited form for structural inspections. And so WorkSafe BC is not mandating the use of this form in particular, but the content on the safe for use certification forms needs to be the same. It needs to meet the same standard. And these letters of assurance are documents that we use quite frequently in our guidelines and standards, and they have been legally vetted and defended in the past for various disciplinary actions. So the goal here is that we're providing these for professionals to use, to know that they can rely on them, that nothing is missing, and for non-professionals to rely on the fact that these have been vetted in the industry and that there's no subclauses, weasel clauses, hidden language that's put in there that's going to absolve professionals of their responsibilities. We've provided also a sample inspection form that walks through a crane inspection plan. So it's a step-by-step guide with a checklist and takes professionals through the entire inspection process. So that's the guidelines in brief. The guidelines will be coming out shortly, and once they're released, you can find them on the Engineers and Geoscientists BC website under Practice Guidelines. And then our Professional Practice Guidelines page has our guidelines sorted by practice area, so this will be under General. I'm sure it will also be distributed through the WorkSafe BC channels, and we'll be talking about it in various publications. So next steps, this has been a long process and very fruitful one working with all of our partners. So I gave myself a little bit of wiggle room. I put up early 2020 for the guideline release, but actually the goal is to have it out before Christmas. And we've committed to holding a seminar next year, we think in early March, to take people through in more depth with our authors, talking about the guidelines and going through at a really granular level what's expected. WorkSafe BC will also be bringing the guidelines up at various events. We'll be talking about it. It'll be included in various publications. We'll have explanatory documents like one-pagers to hand out through different industry channels, writing articles about it. So there's a full communication blitz on once we get this out, and we're hoping to really get this out and disseminate it widely to the industry. And so before I finish up, I just want to thank again our authors, Ryan and Matthew, our WorkSafe BC partners, and our review group from members from BC Crane Safety. We had members from COVA. We had members from a lot of other industry players. And so we really appreciate their hard work and the time that they've put in over the last year and a half. And we definitely couldn't have gotten this to the finish line without their help. So if anyone has any questions, I think we have a few minutes now before lunch. Otherwise, feel free to take down my information, come and see me. I can give you a business card. If you have any questions at any time, we're happy to help, and that's why we do these things. So thanks for your attention.